Hello, everybody. I'm Zane DeYoung. Welcome to my presentation, Bounded Genres, Wholeness, and Bluets. I'm going to be analyzing Bluets by Maggie Nelson. Maggie Nelson is a writer and academic who has authored more than 10 books of poetry and nonfiction. She graduated with a PhD in English literature from the City University of New York and frequently blends scholarship into her creative work. Bluets, her seventh and possibly most famous work, was published in 2009 and combines elements of memoir, prose poetry, and literary criticism. Bluets focuses broadly on themes of physical and emotional pain, heartache, and the color blue. Nelson weaves these together through short vignettes that jump from the personal confessions of the text speaker to her analyses of art and philosophy. By eschewing a traditional narrative structure, Nelson is able to create meaning through juxtaposition. The reader is forced to confront the interconnectedness of emotional experience and literature in a way that would be difficult to achieve through a more traditional format. Because of this, Bluets can be difficult to categorize. Elements of philosophy, literary criticism, hybrid poetry, prose poetry, and confessional poetry are all present. Formally, Bluet's vignettes are numbered and arranged chronologically from 1 to 240. This organizing structure is borrowed from Goethe's theory of color, a philosophical work originally published in 1810 and referenced heavily throughout the text. The vignettes themselves range in size from a single line to a sturdy paragraph and are written from the first person perspective of an unnamed speaker inferred to be an analog for Nelson herself. In her 2015 book of theory, Forms, Whole, Rhythm, Hierarchy, Network, Carolyn Levine introduces the concept of bounded wholes as complex organizing systems interacting with each other in unexpected ways. This arises out of a critique of the belief that a literary work is an enclosed system or perfectly encapsulated object. Yet, while many critics focus on disrupting these bounds, Levine is more interested in exploring the ways in which the structures they provide allow for surprising kinds of progress. Levine lists as an example the decree that separated nuns into completely isolated convents, creating a bounded whole around the pre-existing enclosure of the church itself. The overlaying of the strictures of the decree onto the strictures of the church led to the perception of nuns as especially holy, especially in comparison to the monks who were freer and more mobile. In analyzing Bluets through the lens of a bounded whole, one fairly obvious example stands out, the form of the book itself. As previously mentioned in the presentation, Nelson borrows the text structure from Goethe's theory of color, suggesting that these two works are in conversation with each other, two philosophical texts that explore the relationship between color and experience. However, this is almost immediately complicated when the governing principles of a philosophical text is something traditionally thought of as purely intellectual and impersonal, come into contact with the boundaries of poetry and memoir, two more traditionally emotive genres. The tension between these two has an interesting effect. The personal and emotional content of Nelson's writing can be seen to comment on and challenge the dryness of philosophy or literary criticism. Indeed, in the vignette 23, the speaker directly addresses Goethe's work in a way that synthesizes criticism and poetry. 23 focuses on Goethe's personal turmoil as a direct motivation for writing theory of color in the first place. This tension is established early on within the first vignette, which begins, "Suppose I were to begin by saying that I had fallen in love with the color. Suppose I were to speak this as though it were a confession." Here, the abstract conceptual nature of color, which itself has no universal absolute interpretation, is blended with the achingly personal act of falling in love. This is then further connected to the internal life of the speaker, who compares her love of color to a confession, which not only adds layers of intimacy to the vignette, but can be seen to literally tie Bluets to the confessional genre of poetry. The result of this clash between abstraction and confession is expansive. Each must include elements of the other in order to deliver the emotional message of the vignette. This bears striking resemblance to Levine when she writes that containers do not afford only imprisonment, they also afford centrality and inclusiveness. Another example of boundaries in Nelson's writing comes in the vignette 13, in which the speaker has a job interview where she's asked why she writes about the color blue. Here, the personal sphere of the speaker's fixation bleeds into the professional sphere for career goals, in turn highlighting the difficulty of translating the former in terms acceptable to the latter. Quote, one of the men asks, why blue? People ask me this question often. I never know how to respond. We don't get to choose what or whom we love, writes Nelson. Yet the tension felt by the speaker here is one that is ultimately resolved by the very type of expression she's unable to communicate during the interview. Her inability to answer the question becomes its own kind of answer, one that allows for a freer type of expression than is traditionally allowed for in professional settings. This connects to Levine's writing when she describes literary texts not as unified but as inevitably plural in their forms. Rather than being contained to one sphere or the other, Bluets is capable of both formal and personal expression, and indeed deepens its thematic explorations as a result of this diversity. So yeah, that's my presentation. I have a couple questions to leave you with. First, what genres do you see at work in Bluets? Do you notice that some are favored and used more over others, or is there pretty even distribution between all the various forms that Levine plays with here? Second, can the vignettes and Bluets be considered bounded wholes, or would you just consider the book itself kind of a bounded whole? If that makes sense. I guess I'm curious what you think of like the way that the vignettes kind of play off each other to create meaning within this like circle of a text. Um, and third and last, what do you think Maggie Nelson accomplishes by blending a confessional style of poetry with literary criticism? How do these two genres that are usually kept so far apart from each other kind of complement each other or transform or inform each other? Yeah. So thank you very much for taking the time to watch my presentation. I'm looking forward to reading your responses. Thank you.